Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this research talk by Professor Farok, Contractor. Farok, we are delighted to have you here. For all those here who don't know Farok, Farok is an accomplished academic, a distinguished professor from Rutgers Business School. And Farok has been known in the academic circles for his work on lots of work on corporate strategy alliances, but also multinational key performance relationships. So Farok actually did his undergraduation from University of Bombay, and then went on to study in University of Michigan and then Wharton School that he got a PhD from, and has also taught in Wharton, Copenhagen Business School and several other schools across the globe. Of course, the long list of publications that Farok has will take me forever to list them, but he's also on several of the editorial boards of the journals and is a permanent fellow of the Academy of International Business, among several other achievements. So Farok, we are delighted to have you here, and thanks a lot also for spending time with our doctoral students in the morning. And we are looking forward to this talk on US-China business relationship and implications for India, especially as you wrote in the abstract in the post-President Trump election here. Right. So welcome, Ahmedabad, and thanks for taking time out to speak to us.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Of course, my research, those of you who bothered to go on the internet, I'm just giving you a flavor of some of the current issues, papers in the pipeline. One deals with intangible assets of multinational company parents and their influence on subsidiary profitability, with the idea, the question being, to what extent does that link deteriorate or improve with geographic and cultural and other distance? So that's actually a work I've done with Yong Yang at Sussex and with Ajay, my colleague at Rutgers. Another project I'm involved in right now is from World Bank data, FDI flows coming into each country over a 15-year period. To what extent is that determined statistically by institutional factors at the country level, the ease of doing business, human development indicators, corruption, etc. So that's another ongoing project. Another one with the former PhD students is about Biopharmaceutical Alliances. So essentially R&D alliances. And the first question we asked is, if two pharmaceutical companies are doing an alliance, how close should their relationship be, or how far apart? So we devised measures for the closeness of the interorganizational relationship and what determines it. And then the next part of the research, which is ongoing, is given the closeness or distance of the alliance partner relationship, how does that affect the success of the R&D program? Another paper I'm doing with another set of co-authors is Alliance Portfolio Complexity. Because nowadays, portfolio using the Blau index or the Herfindahl index is quite common. So you have two dimensions. One is partner diversity, the type of partner, and the other is alliance agreement diversity. And these days, databases or bots can give you the actual text of agreements from which you can get this data. And what is the distribution of alliance portfolios over these two dimensions? Another work I continue with co-author Pooja Thakur is about outsourcing and offshoring. And for a big multinational company, there's a 2x2 matrix. You have the organizational change. One is do it in-house versus outsource, domestically or internationally. The other dimension is you do it in the home country, or you do it in your subsidiary, or you do it in a foreign contract research organization. So what determines the distribution of R&D projects over these four quadrants, as it were? And then, of course, the next step is to ask, depending on the distribution over the four quadrants, what is the impact on the success of the R&D mission? So actually, I have many more research angles. which are ongoing, which keeps me busy. Today we're talking about a very interesting policy issue, which is after President Trump saying all kinds of nasty things about China, what is the evolving relationship? And it brings us to the question of, is trade beneficial or not for both countries? And as China makes a transition away from the mass production screwdriver, low-skill assembly, what should India do? Should it take over that kind of work from China? Because the Chinese companies are themselves abdicating that kind of work. So when Apple comes to India, will it bring Foxconn along with it? Maybe some of you know more than I do about the ongoing negotiation between Apple and the Indian government. Because for a while, Apple said, we won't do that, and the Indian government said, no, we don't want you because you have to fulfill a 30% local value added. That was the initial condition of the Modi government. Do you know what's the current story with the Apple proposed investment in India? Anyway, my guess is that if Apple comes, they will, sorry? They've agreed to do 30%. Because, let me hesitate a bit, what Apple is paying Foxconn for assembly in China is between $8 and $12 per item. If it's an iPhone, it may be close to $8. If it's an iPad, they may pay $11 or $12. So the value added in China by Foxconn, even though there are hundreds of thousands of employees of Foxconn, the value added is fairly low. So I don't know how many years they will be given grace period in order to achieve the 30%. So anyway, we'll end this presentation by asking two broad strategy issues for the Indian economy. Should Make in India mean mass production of a routine level, or should it be in more highly profitable parts of the value chain like R&D or brand development? So the alternative is for Indian companies to follow in the footsteps of Samsung, which 25 years ago most Americans had never heard of. Most Europeans had never heard of Samsung. Today the brand is so good, and the research is so good as well, that it's an accepted name, rivaling the perception and quality of Apple. Anyway, so here are some of the things we will look at. What I tried to do in this piece is what I don't think too many people or anybody has tried, which is to actually count the number of jobs involved in the US related to trade and FDI with China, as well as the number of jobs in China related to trade and FDI in the United States. And then what are some of the money values? Is it realistic to bring jobs back to the United States like Trump is saying? You know, the number 6. The Chinese have very kindly recirculated much of their trade surplus back into US Treasury bonds. And they hold something like 2.1 trillion today, even though they've drawn them down a bit. And then, as I said, implications for India and conclusions. So let me get into this. I mean, this is kind of silly, but it's worth repeating what you know already, that just these 3 countries, China, the US, and India, constitute 40% of world GDP. And in fact, if you use nominal exchange rates, it may be almost half. And of course, it's also 40% of the world's population. So just these 3 countries dominate the world scene in terms of their relative importance. That's what I was trying to say. In terms of population, one of the issues with China is that around 2012, because of the one-child policy, their population plateaued out, or is beginning to plateau out, whereas India in green is still increasing. And I ask later the question, is this a demographic dividend or a demographic time bomb? Because if you don't provide jobs for the approximately 13 million males who turn 18 every year in India, forget about women. I mean, I'm saying, sorry, I should be careful. Not forget about women, but the unfortunate fact is that the 13 million figure is just males every year reaching the age 18 in India and looking for jobs. And of course, one of the things I lament later on is that in India, the participation of women is regrettably much lower than in China or the United States. In terms of manufacturing output. Most Americans don't realize. They listen to Trump and believe these doomsday scenarios saying, oh, Rust Belt, our manufacturing is going downhill, we are not vital anymore. That's nonsense. The US is still the most productive manufacturing economy in the world. And it wasn't until 2010 that China overtook the US in the total value of manufactured output. Until then, the US was number one, and even today, the US is a close number two, despite the fact that average wages in US manufacturing sector is something like $35, $37 an hour. So you ask yourself, I mean, you're educated, but ordinary people might ask themselves, how can they pay so much money to their workers, $37 an hour, and still be the most productive and one of the biggest manufacturers in the world? And of course, the answer is productivity of the worker. I hope you can see this. Anyway, this is the trade balance between the US and China. So the US imports almost $500 billion, but exports only $161 billion. So that means there's a deficit of $338 million. And like I said earlier, and I'll say it in more detail later, the Chinese put most of this surplus back into the US in the form of American government treasury bonds, meaning the dollars their exporters collect are just handed back by the People's Bank of China, their central bank, to buy pieces of paper called US treasury bonds. And it's a misleading, well, I've said this already. So Trump said, China is raping our country, and it's the greatest theft in the history of the world. You know, he says interesting things like that for his voting bloc. And he's threatened to impose 45% tariffs. There are allegations of dumping, subsidies, which is true. You know, many of these allegations have more than a little substance behind them. I mean, even in India, on the what you call footpaths, I see people selling good watches, giving perfect timing, for 100 rupees. And I say, wait a minute, 100 rupees is like, what, $1.75 or $1.50 or something like that? Chinese factory made it. Presumably they have some profits. There's transportation costs to India. There are middlemen markups. The guy on the footpath is making some little bit of profit margin. How is it possible to buy a watch for 100 rupees? And I used to buy these watches when I used to go to China. I've been there more than 24 times to teach in our program over there. And it would give perfect time for a year, year and a half. And then the battery would run out. So I would just throw it away. Because the cost of a battery is twice the cost of the watch. Cost of a battery in the US is twice the cost of a watch. So part of that explanation must be Chinese government subsidies, which some people allege. Overcapacity, you know this whole issue of dumping, right? What is dumping? Well, from economics theory point of view, there's only one clean definition. If a producer is selling below variable cost, then no question, they're dumping. Because every time you sell below variable cost, you're losing money on that sale. But 95% of dumping, I'm just making an educated guess, in the world, is selling above variable cost, but way below the average cost in the country or for the world as a whole. So then what is dumping? Dumping is nothing more than price discrimination across markets, across countries. And from the economist's point of view, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as your total revenue are greater than not just your total variable cost, but also greater than your average cost. And accompanied by subsidies given by the Chinese government in the form of cheap loans or non-performing loans. They just say, okay, if it's a government-related company, they'll say, take this money, don't pay it back ever. Or cheap land, etc. Then they can do it that way. And there's big overcapacity in steel and aluminum, for which one of the Indian companies has been hurt very badly. In fact, most Indian steel producers have been hurt. Can you name one that is especially hurt by Chinese dumping, so-called? Meaning it's still above variable cost to the Chinese firm when they sell in the UK market. I said India, but it's, you know, I'm talking about Tata Steel. The Chorus plant is in deep trouble because of Chinese low-priced sales. And currency manipulation. So Trump has been hitting on that very hard. Not just Trump. All the way back to President Reagan, American leaders have been saying that the Chinese are allegedly undervaluing their currency. So let me ask the doctoral students and everybody here the question. When we say undervaluation against what benchmark? What do we mean by undervaluation? See, the public, especially the American voter, they hear these Trump pronouncements, alleged undervaluation of the Chinese currency. They don't know what the heck it means, but some of you may know. When we say undervaluation, it's against what benchmark? Against the PPP benchmark, purchasing power parity theoretical exchange rate, which is calculated by economists and accounting firms, but doesn't exist anywhere except in the mind of the economist or the accounting firm. So I'll show you some figures later on. And of course, there's cyber espionage. In terms of espionage capacity, American government's cyber espionage capacity is unrivaled in the world. They're the best. But there's an asymmetry, because when a Chinese government hacker group goes into the website of an American, not website, I mean the computer records of an American firm and steal secret, they immediately share it with Chinese companies. In fact, the whole mission of the Chinese government is that we've got to help our companies. When the Americans hack into a European or Chinese or Russian company and get their secrets, they don't share it with American companies. Because there's this, as far as I know, there's a separation between government and private business. So there's asymmetry. Anyway, what will happen in the future, we don't know. So why is the China-US trade so unbalanced? On the Chinese side, very low wages. Now, mind you, this figure of $1.70 per hour is very misleading. You know that averages are always misleading statements. Because it's like saying, my head is in the refrigerator and my feet are in the oven, but on average, I feel comfortable. So, you know, the point being that this is the all China average. In the East Coast, where most of manufacturing takes place in China, the wages are somewhere between $4 and $5 an hour. So for abundant and docile labor force, frugality, they save a lot. So they put the money into Chinese economy, Chinese banks. A cozy relationship, not only lower interest rates, but non-performing loans, with the assumption that, especially if it's an SOE, state-owned enterprise, we give you the loan and, you know, theoretically you're supposed to pay it back, but don't worry about it. Absorption and transfer of Western technology, either through cyber espionage or direct government policies where they bluntly tell the foreign investor, if you want permission to come and set up your joint venture in China, you've got to promise, this is out in the open, you've got to promise transfer of technology, the latest designs to our Chinese partner. I don't think Indian government does that, right? Any requirement that the foreign technology must be shared with the Indian partner. I don't think there's such a...
I think increasingly there's a stress on this, especially in the high value of technology, where the government expects that over a period of time, especially in sectors like defense and others.
That must be discussed informally. There's no formal requirement. In China, there's a formal requirement saying, in fact, at the negotiation stage, the Chinese government will be sitting there with the two joint venture partners and they'll say, what is it? This is such and such model technology. You got to promise to transfer it within X number of years.
In some cases, yes, especially in the place used like let's say an aeronautical computer.
In the defense sector.
In the defense sector,
right.
The government doesn't depend on say that.
Right.
Especially in Russia, when we have a joint venture where they develop it with us, so we get the technology transfer to the process.
But that's where the government is both the local partner and the government, right?
So the defense procurement policy says so, 30% offset clause.
Okay.
It is there, so it's formulated.
30% offset meaning local value added, is that it?
Like if you were to go for the Rafale deal, then 30% of the supposed to be sourced from within India. That's the deal.
Okay.
That's what it says.
But one more thing I want, when you mentioned the PPP in terms of undervalued, is that the only basis? Because PPP wise, even we would be we are undervalued currency. If you look at the US and India,
You mean the rupee?
currency would be undervalued.
You mean the rupee?
Yeah, I mean PPP basis, you compare with Europe or US.
If you look at the Economist magazine, they have this Big Mac index. According to that, the rupee is undervalued.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So we undervalued.
You believing that? Some economists are saying that the rupee is either appropriately valued or slightly overvalued. Because, you know PPP theory, it has to do also with the relative inflation rates in the two countries. And Indian inflation rates have been, now they're down to about 5, 6, 7% if you believe the government. But they were in the 10% range. So if you take the differential between the inflation rates in the US and India, you're talking about a difference in the last 10 years averaging about 7, 8%. So according to PPP theory, the rupee should have been devaluing on an annual basis at something like 7, 8% per year, which it hasn't. It's been sort of, you know, it was stuck at 45 for a long time, then it went to 60, then it was, Amit was telling me that it was stuck at 60 for a while, and now it's 66. So you're right. One of the problems with the PPP theory, and it's only a theory, it doesn't exist anywhere except in the mind of the economists. You know how they measure it? They will create a basket of goods and services and put several hundred items in the basket, 1 liter of gasoline, 1 haircut, 1 month's apartment rental. So depending on the economists, they'll put different items in the basket and price it in both countries, and you can get very different calculations. There's another problem with PPP empirical calculations. Depending on whether you're measuring the basket in Shanghai or in Guizhou province, you can get a huge difference in the cost and the pricing. So, in fact, I'll show you the difference between the World Bank estimate for the Chinese currency's PPP rate and the IMF.
Yeah, that's the reason I asked you, like, would PPP the only parameter, or would there be something else when you get on to saying a country is undervalued its currency?
That's the only one I can think of, because when we say undervalued, in comparison with what benchmark? The only benchmark we can think of is, which in effect is saying the same thing as export competitiveness, right? That's what it amounts to.
But isn't that the, like, if you let the yuan float in the free market, then its value would actually appreciate, whereas for the rupee it would actually depreciate. Because that is why the government is sort of dirty for different reasons. Our RBI tries to keep the price constant, whereas the Chinese government would try to devalue the yuan so that their exports must be better.
It's a little, yeah, but it's a little more complex story. I'll get to that. What history of the RMB. And of course, low transportation costs, because look at this example. This is a hypothetical example because I don't know any ship has been loaded with as much as 525 million T-shirts. Actually, in theory, you can. If you flatten the T-shirt and you don't have boxes, and you just put T-shirt on T-shirt, one mega ship can carry 525 million T-shirts or 75 million pairs of shoes. And on that theoretical calculation, the cost per T-shirt or shirt would be only 2.5 cents across the Pacific Ocean. And the staff on the ship is only 13 people. And now they're building even bigger ships. So low transportation costs. Anyway, on the US side, you have, it's not the richest country in the world, the United States, but on an after-tax disposable income, it's one of the highest in the world. Because taxes are relatively low, contrary to what the Republicans are saying. Taxes are below the OECD average. Fiercely competitive and open market, companies from all over the world, including American firms, fight for the consumer. And a lot of things like garments and shoes, they're price-driven rather than brand. I mean, of course, there's always high-end items in clothing and apparel and shoes, but otherwise it's not brand-loyal public. And they're throwaway prices, which induce a throwaway society. So most Americans will buy a shirt, let's say at Walmart. You've heard of Walmart, right? It's the low end where most of the stuff is in China. You buy a perfectly good shirt for $10, $15. You wear it for a few months. Then you get bored with it. So you say, I'm giving it to charity, like Salvation Army and other charities. And Americans think they're doing charity. what Salvation Army and other companies do, they bundle the clothing into massive amorphous piles, and they actually bring in a compressor to compress the bale, and they put it into a ship and send it to Africa, where the garment is sold for $1 each. There's a famous documentary where a woman journalist was walking around in Nairobi, and she saw a shirt which was very familiar looking. A man was wearing it. And so she stopped him and said, please, can I look at the label behind your collar? Because she had written her name on the label. And sure enough, it was the same shirt. It was a 15-minute documentary. So anyway, throwaway prices, throwaway society, consumption is king. And so on one side of the Pacific, you have excess consumption, very low savings rate. On the Chinese side, you have high savings rate, frugal people working hard, relatively disciplined labor so far. So that explains the reasons. Anyway, I won't bore you with this calculation, but I tried to get some estimate of the number of workers involved. In this case, only in trade, not FDI. And I did it based on the World Bank's LVX share, which is the labor content in each country's export. So for the US, it's 0.47. For China, it's 0.26. So I use that figure to multiply by the, to get an estimate of the labor content in Chinese exports to the US and US exports to China. And then taking average salaries, getting an estimate of the number of people involved. So long and the short of it is something like 16 million Chinese are employed in exporting to the US. In the US, it's only about 1.2 million. So the numbers are not that large when you really think about it. And in this case, China has much more to lose in the case of a trade war, 16 million people compared to 1.24 million people. One quick comment. Notice that the graph from 1995 to 2011 and continuing today for the US is a negative slope. Why? Why do you think? The labor content in American exports to China is declining.
Higher value items, what I would say, probably more automation.
Yeah, so you gave two answers, both of which are correct. The real explanation is increased automation over the years. I mean, many American factories have astonishingly few workers. Just as this mega ship is so automated now, it can be run by only 13 people, including the captain across the... But when you said high value, that is true. That's not part of this explanation, the negative slope. But in a way, it's an unfair comparison. The US makes Boeing 737. China makes toasters. And I did a rough calculation once that it takes 55,000 toasters to equal the value of one 737. So, but China, by the way, now is catching up. You know, through government support, they're now going to introduce next year their own 120-seat commercial aircraft for the first time. And of course, the quality may be bad. People, who knows, I hope not. Anybody will be hurt. But they will force the local airlines to buy that and muscle into the commercial aircraft market in competition with what is so far a duopoly, Airbus and Boeing. So anyway, later on I'll say this again, that Trump is saying, let's blame China for the loss in American jobs. Well, that's mostly a fallacious argument, because for every one job lost through international trade, one American job lost through international trade, there are 3 to 4 jobs lost in the last 20 years through automation. That is much more of a job killer than international trade. So now, switching from trade to FDI, let's look at the FDI relationship. This is from a consulting firm called Rhodium Group, which arguably is even better data than from the American Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is sort of lags in reporting. So one quick comment. Blue is acquisition, green is greenfield. You know the difference between acquisition and greenfield. Greenfield means a foreign company comes in and buys a green field and they bring in the bulldozers, erect the factory and start from scratch. Acquisition is, so like Indian companies, you know the answer. Like Indian companies, why do acquisitions dominate over greenfield as far as the Chinese are concerned? Same thing with Indians. They're going for foreign
IT company, the acquisition by Infosys.
Right. So you acquire a ready market, a ready sales force, but in many cases you're acquiring...
Actually, it's a client synergy also you look at. Because if your product clients are similar to the one you're acquiring, so you get a ready-made access to instant access to those clients for this solution.
Economies of scale, but also access to the foreign technology, which you now own, as it were. And another quick comment would be that Chinese investment in the US didn't really take off until the mid-2000s. It was almost nothing, and then it suddenly has zoomed. And it's mostly located in the periphery, California, Texas, East Coast, etc., which is, again, no surprise. So once again, I won't bore you with the details, but I did a rough calculation of the number of jobs involved in FDI relationship between the two countries. So you have 6,677 subsidiaries and affiliates of American companies in China, and approximately 1,200 Chinese affiliates in the US. And the rough calculation I came up with is you're talking about 90,000 American jobs where Americans are working for Chinese affiliates and subsidiaries, whereas in China, the figure is something like 1.4 to 1.6 million. Why? Because American investment in China is much, much older. You know, like I just said, Chinese investment in the US didn't really take off until around 2005. So putting FDI and trade together, exports and FDI, how many jobs are at stake? And like I said, yeah, these estimates can be a little fuzzy, but at least gives us a ballpark idea. Nobody else, as far as I know, has come up with these numbers. You're talking about roughly 17, 18 million jobs in China at stake. See, my title is, what is at stake in the relationship? And about 1.3 to 1.6 million jobs in the US, which is not a great number, but it's significant enough that it can cause a lot of disruption if there was a war or a trade war or a dispute between the two countries. Okay, now I'm switching to another calculation. The fact that Chinese imports are coming into the US, reasonably well-made products at a low price, what is the consumer benefit per household per year? Actually, the numbers are not that big because 81%, 82% of consumer spending is made in the US from US parts. You know, the average, if you believe Trump, everything is coming from China, which is utter nonsense. You know, the trouble with politicians is that they'll say something, and if they say it with a strong enough voice, then a lot of people believe that. And if you notice Trump's speeches, he has a tendency to say the same thing 2 or 3 times. So again, that is in the approach that you say it 2 or 3 times, then people will believe you. Anyway, the Chinese content, I'll jump to the next slide. If you look at the made in China content of what the American consumer spends money on, you're talking about 2.7%. And it's mainly concentrated still in very innocuous items like clothing, shoes, and so on. So the percentages are much higher in clothing and shoes than in other household equipment, meaning toasters, refrigerators, and so on. So the calculation goes like this. If, hypothetically speaking, all the imports from China were stopped, Trump imposes a 45% tariff or just says no more Chinese imports. Hypothetically, if all that production were done in the US, I say hypothetically because that's not going to happen, what would be the additional cost to the consumer? Total consumer spending is about 11.5 billion. Made in China, 2.7% of that. And And out of that, 55% is overhead and intermediary markups. So it's only 45% of the 312 billion or 140 billion that would be the actual money going to China. Assuming US wages are 8 times Chinese wages, then if you multiply that 42, let's see, where was I? Yeah, so the labor content of Chinese imports coming into the US is 42 billion. You multiply that by 8, you're talking about labor content jumping from 42 billion to 337 billion. And so the additional cost would be simply 337 minus 42, which is 295, 170, or 295 billion additional dollars. How many households are there in the US? Approximately 124 million. So you spread that additional cost over each household. On average, you're looking at $2,380 extra out of the pocket of the average US household. Again, you'll say, well, that's not a huge number. It's not a huge number for a person like me in the upper middle class, right? I can sustain it. If the shirt, instead of costing $15, costs $20, I'll buy a shirt anyway. But think about who goes to Walmart, who goes to the low-end shops like Target and Walmart. It's low-income Americans. You know, the average household income in America is only about $50,000. Median is only $50,000. And there's a huge, one of the issues with the US society is that there's a big tail of the distribution. I mean, you have poor people, unemployed, homeless, there's a long tail. For them, if you're earning only $20,000, $30,000 a year, the additional $2,380 is a big extra burden. So he says, I will bring jobs back to China, but the more likely outcome, if imports from China were stopped, is that the jobs would go to Bangladesh. They wouldn't necessarily come back to the US, they'd go to Vietnam. And this is not a hypothetical argument, because already Chinese companies, for some of them, their break-even exchange rate is about 5.8 RMB per dollar. And you know that last year, the RMB almost reached 6. So many Chinese companies are saying our margins are already squeezed, and if it goes to 5.8, we'll have 0 profits. They've already done an FDI from China to Vietnam, from China to Ethiopia, to shift their close down operations in China, shift them to Ethiopia and Bangladesh. Okay, so now we're talking about the broader context, comparing US manufacturing with China, Japan, and Germany. So this is the share of each country in world total manufacturing. And yes, the US share has gone down a bit, but that's not because there's anything wrong with the competitiveness of American manufacturing, but look at the red dot. That's China, which has muscled into the space, and that too only since around 2005, 2006. And like I said, if you look at this inflection point, it's 2010, when for the first time ever, China took over the #1 position from the US in terms of the total value of manufacturing. Well, this is saying the same thing. The inflection point is somewhere in 2010 when China zoomed ahead. Not in terms of quality items, you know, you're comparing toasters with 747, but just in terms of the aggregate dollar value of the manufacturing production. And remember, now you have a big already emerged domestic Chinese market for which they're producing, whereas the US market is sort of flat. So if you look at the blue, you're talking about the manufacturing output, this time in total billion-dollar value. The US value keeps increasing. Of course, there was this dip in 2008, but the general trend is a positive slope. What is the yellow? I'm trying to think. Oh, Japan. Japan has been sort of in the doldrums since the 1990s. Okay, what does this graph tell us? This is from the Federal Reserve Bank in the US. This is the total number of jobs, thousands of persons, okay? So US manufacturing jobs reached around 19.5 million around 1980, and have gone down since then. And this is saying the same thing. This is the ratio. The red line is the ratio of manufacturing employees divided by all employees. So no doubt, manufacturing's importance as a share of GDP has gone down, okay? But look at this graph. The total output has kept going up. Again, the same answer. How can that be? The answer is automation. You go to a pharmaceutical factory or even a toothpaste factory in the United States, there are hardly any workers. You look around, you don't see anybody. It's all automated production. And the thing spits out tubes of toothpaste at the end of the line. And even the packaging is now becoming more automated. Previously, there'd be people who would pick up the tube of toothpaste and put it into the box. Now even that is being automated. Okay, this is saying the same thing. Manufacturing jobs since the depression, or the recession of 2009 have increased, but the manufacturing output has increased even more, which is saying the same thing, automation. This is from BCG, as I remember, Deloitte. Deloitte has an index of global manufacturing competitiveness, not just the cost, I mean, everything taken together. The 2016 ranking was China was number 1, US was number 2, India was number 11 at 67 compared to 100. So they're ranking the top country as 100 and then ranking others on that index. But look where Deloitte is saying things will be in 2020. The US will surpass China. Why? Because the efficiency and the intensity of competition and the degree of automation in China is forcing American companies to become the most productive in the world. And look at India. According to Deloitte, India will rise from rank 11 to rank 5. And this is because I think the Modi government is taking steps to try and relax labor laws, improve infrastructure, etc. Okay, so this is a somewhat dated piece of mine in Yale Global, but the basic message hasn't changed since 2012 when I published this. So let's compare some of these countries, the US, Germany, France, Japan, and China, on certain productivity indexes. If you can read this, I don't know if it's very easy, but this is compensation per hour. This is not a productivity index. This is just how much workers are paid. $34 at that time per hour paid to the American worker. $47 paid to the German worker. Only $1.60 on average, all China average, pays to the Chinese worker. So on the face of it, the public at least doesn't understand how can any manufacturing occur in Europe or in the United States when the wages are so much higher than in China? And the answer is productivity. So let's look at some productivity measures. This is value added per employee in $1,000 per year. In the US, each employee per year contributes $145,000 in value added by the fact that he's working for the company. In Germany, it's $84,000. In Japan, very, very respectable figure, $122,000. In China, only $13,700 contributed by each Chinese employee. Well, when you have so many workers, you hire a lot of them, so per worker, the added value will be relatively small. Also, if you're a Chinese factory owner, why would you want to automate? Although they're beginning to do that now. You'd rather hire more workers to get the same thing done. Okay, let's look at another productivity index. Manufacturing value added per hour worked in dollars. So, like I said, in the US, they pay the worker in 2010 $34, but that worker in the same 1 hour would contribute $73 in value to the company. In Germany, they pay $47 per hour. They contribute $59 per hour in value contributed. In China, they pay only $1.60, but the Chinese employee ends up contributing to the company $7.19 in value created. So therefore, there is one productivity index where China comes out on top, which is this one. The value added per dollar of wages paid. So in the US, it's only 1.93, meaning the value created is roughly double what the worker earns. In China, it's 4.5. Why? Because they're paid very low. So in that index, the Chinese worker comes out on top. But otherwise, the US is by far the most productive manufacturing economy in the world, which the average American voter doesn't understand.
Just a small question. This manufacturing value added, very often these calculations include the value of wages. Have you taken them out specifically, or have you, or if you haven't, then they include the value of wages in the other column?
No, as good question. As far as I remember, now I wrote this in 2012, as far as I know, this is the net value created.
No, normally it wouldn't be. It includes because any notion of value added from a financial statement includes wages.
Right.
So you need to take it out to get the net value added.
This is not from financial. You may be right. Look, you certainly may be right. I took this from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, from the OECD.
They do the same. It includes wages.
Okay, so let's say that you're correct, but still the basic message is that the American worker is by far the most productive in the world, not because they're superior human beings. It's just that American companies have spent the mega millions or billions in order to put in automated equipment, with the result that each worker is so much more productive, right? So that basic message is still true. I mean, if you took away, as you're saying, from the numerator of the ratio, the wage content, you'd still have a very positive ratio. Numerator would still be bigger. But thank you for the comment. I'd better check on this.
Actually, what will happen is your ranking will change.
The ranking,
if you look at the figure for Japan, look at your own figure for Japan.
You mean this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
You get 32, whereas for US you get only 29.
I see what you're saying. So you mean subtract from 73.34 and subtract from 63.31. That's a very good comment. So I'd better check into this. Thank you. Yeah, okay. It would change the ranking somewhat, yeah. Japan will be number one. I mean, the difference between 63 and 31 is more than the difference between 73 and 34. Yeah. Also, what I've not mentioned over here is the number of hours worked per year in different countries. The Americans are among the most hardworking people. It's about 1,800 something hours worked per year, partially because of the barbaric practice of giving people only 10 days holiday, 10 business days holiday per year. You know, Americans work very hard. There are only two countries where they put in more hours per year, South Korea and Japan. And you know why? Their cultural practices, the South Korean or Japanese employee will not go home until the big boss has gone home. So they may just sit there doing nothing. As soon as the big boss goes, then they leave. Otherwise, in France, the comparable figure is 1,400 something hours per year. And you know, this is a side comment, nothing to do with this discussion.
Scandinavian countries would be even lesser.
Sorry?
Scandinavian
Yeah.
would be even lesser.
And all those countries.
HDI, they count the highest.
Right, exactly. So these countries say, look, what is life all about? Is it about efficiency and productivity, or is it about a reasonable balance and enjoyment of life? Maybe they're right. Anyway, so we'll move forward. This is sort of saying the same thing, that China's total manufacturing output is now bigger than the US. Let's look at the question of jobs coming back to the US, or what is called reshoring in academic jargon. General Electric, which had an appliance division making air conditioners, and they make all kinds of things from aircraft engines to wind turbines to They had an appliance division. And they tried very, very hard to bring jobs back, reshore them to the US. It didn't work. I mean, in theory, it makes sense because the American worker, if you select the workers carefully, they're very productive with automated equipment. But the problem was that the supply chain for the air conditioner or refrigerator components has been established in China. There are very few part suppliers left in the United States. So their theoretical argument didn't work, and they gave up the attempt and sold their appliance division to a company called Haier for $5.4 billion. Have you heard of Haier? Americans still haven't heard much of Haier. Like Samsung 25 years ago, nobody knew what it was. But what Haier is trying to do, and that's one of the questions I ask here, why do we think Haier can succeed where GE failed in bringing jobs back to the United States?
There are two reasons why Haier is already succeeding. If you really look at the segments where Haier is already number one, I'll give you a few segments.
In the Chinese market?
In the American market.
Small refrigerator.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's one. So you know it. And the second is that because it has a portfolio approach, it has gone into a range of products. So it has
mobile phones.
It has amazing amounts of back synergies in making electronics.
Supply chains.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So Haier thinks it can succeed where GE failed because they have the supply chain base in China, and also they don't mind several years of losses because their objective is to establish the Haier brand in the minds of American consumers, because that's where you go to the more profitable part of the value chain.
Haier is actually a wrong example because Haier manufactures in America. It does not import from China so much as...
No, but they only assemble in the US. Much of the components are still being imported.
Oh, but they're manufacturing and assembling in America.
Right, so
value added is really happening in America.
Well, it depends on how much the assembly value added is versus the imported components. So if they're doing just final assembly, then the percentage value added in America may not be that high, but they can at least claim assembled in America.
They wouldn't have taken over GE's appliances if they did not want to manufacture everything in America. So they're at the high end, they're not at the low end.
No, they don't have a cachet or distinguished brand name yet. They're trying to achieve
In segments, if you look at the product segments and if you look at geographic segments, you may find them to be leaders already.
Certainly in China.
In America.
Well, yeah, so in wine coolers. Yes, so I know, if you buy a wine cooler, and that's not a low, you're right, it's not a low-end item. Only very high-income households will have a purchase called a wine cooler. It does nothing except store bottles of wine.
What's also amazing is that they don't hire too many Chinese in America. Most of their managers and leaders are American.
Right. It's like Tata in Land Rover and so on. I think most of the employees are British. But I think part of the strategy, that's my considered opinion, part of the strategy is that they want to build a higher brand name in the minds of the American consumer so that later on, let's say 5-10 years from today, they can extract more value based on the brand equity. Very quick comment. Trump, of course, being a nationalist or nativist, he wanted to insist that every single value added in his cap, sorry, you can't read this, Make America Great Again, should be American made. Didn't work because Associated Press did a microscopic analysis and found that some of the content of the cap came from, because when you talk about cloth and stitching and garments and things like that, the supply chain is spread all over the world. And even if you try very hard, you can't avoid non-American content. Okay, we were talking earlier about the value of the RMB. This is going back to ancient history, to the early 1980s. Believe it or not, in the early 1980s, the RMB was less than 2 per dollar. Just as somebody told me that 100 or more years ago, the rupee was stronger than the US dollar. That means 1 rupee could buy like $5 or something like that. So anyway, they started there. I mean, this is the opposite story. Anyway, 2 RMB per dollar, and then followed a series of devaluations, massive devaluations. You know, in this graph, because we're measuring in RMB per dollar, upward is devaluation. It reached almost 8.8 before it stabilized and was fixed for 10 years at 8.27. And then in June of 2005, they very grudgingly and slowly and with anger, the Chinese under pressure from, who was the president at that time? 2005 was George W. Bush and the Europeans. Under pressure from the Americans and Europeans, they grudgingly started to appreciate their currency. It reached almost 6, which for some Chinese firms is dangerously close to their break-even exchange rate. What has happened since 2015 is actually another devaluation. Remember, devaluation is going up in this graph. And why did this happen? Despite the fact that the Chinese government are actually trying to fight devaluation. They're trying to appreciate their currency, keep it stable. Answer, there's so much wealth bottled up in China. Yes, becoming a rich country now. I mean, at least there are enough rich people. And when you're wealthy, you want to diversify your assets. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So how do you get money out of China? Well, you can, anyway, you can do over-invoicing, under-invoicing of exports, over-invoicing of imports. You can create dummy companies in Hong Kong or in the Cayman Islands and then go to the foreign exchange authorities and say, look, we have a subsidiary. Now please allow us to transfer so many million overseas. So there's a lot of bottled up wealth seeking an outlet. And of course, the government has been trying to fight that. And how do they fight it? Now under the auspices of the IMF, they're trying to be a sort of a market-oriented foreign exchange market, which means that if somebody says, take my RMB, give me dollars so I can support my subsidiary in Hong Kong. Actually, they may send it to buy an apartment in Sydney, but that's a separate story. Then the Chinese government would have to try and prop up the RMB by buying the RMB. How does in a market-driven foreign exchange market, how does a country support its currency? By buying it. But of course, if the agent of the government buys its own currency, it has to give the counterparty dollars. Where do the dollars come from? From the previously accumulated dollar reserves of the Chinese government, which, and I'll show you the numbers shortly. Maybe I got the slides wrong. Oh, sorry. I'll show you that later. Here's the summary story. The Chinese had reserves that were 3 or 4, anyway, they've gone through $1 trillion of reserves in an attempt, unsuccessful until 2 months ago, to stop the devaluation of their currency. They were trying to prop it up because they had to give the counterparty dollars. They drew 1 trillion worth down, and it didn't work. So what they did is reintroduce currency controls, more stringent currency controls, which are more stringent than India. I believe in India, a person can send out of India $1 million a year. Is that correct? Whereas in China, the limit is now only $50,000, which has worked to stabilize the currency at around, see, they didn't want it to go appreciate, sorry, they didn't want it to go between a band of 6 and 7. Anyway, this slide is talking about undervaluation. So the IMF calculation is, this is the OECD numbers. Their PPP rate is 3.4. IMF is in the same ballpark. The World Bank number for PPP, because they use a different basket and they measure it differently, is closer to 5 point something, 5.0, 5.1. And well, we've answered this question. Why is there a difference between the economists? Because depending on what you put in the basket and depending on where you measure it, in which city or town, you can get very different calculations. So Also, another thing, as you know, with the PPP calculation is based on inflation. So especially on the East Coast, where wages are now something like $4.50 to $5 per hour, many companies are not that competitive anymore. And wage inflation increases the PPP exchange rate, other things being equal. So the US has been running a trade deficit not just against China, but against the whole world. And not only for 1 or 2 years, but for an astonishing 40 years. Now, how is this possible? You know, if you're an ordinary country, let's call it hypothetically a country called Fredonia. Fredonia has a trade deficit. That means that at the end of the year, foreigners have surplus Fredos, we'll call that their currency in their hands. Foreigners don't want to hold the other country's currency, so they'll dump it in the foreign exchange market, and as a result, the Fredo will devalue. Now, that's a self-correcting phenomenon, because let's say in the next accounting period, in year 2, after the devaluation of the country's currency, exports will increase, more competitive. Similarly, imports will decrease, and therefore the trade deficit will shrink or disappear. So this is, at least in theory, and for most countries, this works. There's a self-correcting mechanism. But there are 3 exceptions. One is if there's no free-floating exchange rate. If it's a dictated exchange rate, like in Argentina or wherever, then the theory doesn't work. The second exception is like India, where India has run a persistent trade deficit, but more than offset by the remittances coming from the Gulf into, so the capital account is better. The third exception is the United States, which for 40 years, not just against China, but against the whole world, has run a deficit.
That's because of the petrodollars?
Not petrodollars, the recycling. Foreigners earn more dollars because they export more than they import from the United States, but they're very kind enough to put those dollars back into US Treasury bonds.
But all the oil exchange, oil trade happens in dollars. So it's also in the interest of a lot of people to ensure the US dollar doesn't.
So same story, when there was a petrodollar crisis, the oil exporting countries like Saudi Arabia were kind enough to recycle the dollars back into US dollar-denominated assets. But today, the US is almost at a point where it's a net energy exporter. I mean, it's another thing that most Americans don't realize. I'm not saying in oil, I'm saying energy, which is a different story. The US is almost a net energy exporter. In fact, this month or last month, from Louisiana, from the New Orleans port, they will start exporting liquefied natural gas to Latin America. So anyway, the answer is, not only do the foreigners that earn more dollars bring the dollars back to the US, but specifically, they invest in US government treasury bonds. So this graph is saying what? The total, at the same time, the federal debt, and here Trump is correct in saying that the US federal debt is, this is actually old information, it's reached something like 19 trillion. 19 trillion is what the American government owes to all those suckers or people who have bought those pieces of paper called government bonds. So there's actually a connection between the 2 deficits. One is the trade deficit, the other is the government budget deficit. And I don't need to tell you this, but what is the government budget deficit? The government spends more than it takes in as tax revenue. How is the difference accounted for? By issuing pieces of paper to whoever sucker wants to buy it, called a government bond. And that money comes in and makes up the difference between the tax revenue and the expenditures. So there's a direct connection. I mean, don't blame Obama. He had to meet the worst recession in 70 years. So yes, the deficit was very high under Obama, but still, I just said this. If only Americans were buying US Treasury bonds, those pieces of paper, interest rates might be almost double what they are today. Because there's a lot of money coming in from Japan, China, even India has 123 billion invested in US Treasury bonds, the Indian government, the Reserve Bank of India. So not only are the Chinese and other foreigners sustaining the excess consumption in the US consumer is very happy. I buy a shirt for $10, $15, I wear it for a few months, I get bored with it, I give it to charity, it ends up in Nairobi. I buy another shirt. Keeps the American customer happy. They also help to fund the US government budget deficit. This money coming back to the US also keeps interest rates lower than they would be otherwise. So the US government, I ran ahead of myself. Excess consumption is the trade deficit. The Chinese exporter who earns the dollars gives the dollars to their bank and gets RMB at the prevailing exchange rate. The bank, in turn, gives the dollars to the central bank, the People's Bank of China, which then accumulates those extra dollars every month, every year, and so on. And what to do with the surplus dollars? Instead of just sitting it in cash, they put it back into, well, some of it, of course, is used to finance imports coming into China, and of course finance also outward FDI going out of China to other countries, but much of it goes back into US Treasury bonds. ABS is asset-backed securities, which are things like bundled mortgage, car loans, etc. So it's not only helping keeping interest rates low and mortgage rates low, but also car loans are marginally cheaper for the American consumer because of the willingness of foreigners to buy US Treasury bonds. And of course, on the other side, it keeps the 16 to 18 million Chinese workers in a job. So what's wrong with this picture? I mean, I use the word happy in many places over here. This is a happy thing for both countries. What's wrong with it? Sorry, please. Yeah. So the Chinese are buying, the Indians are buying, the Japanese are buying.
So the source of demand is outside the country?
No, mostly it's Americans, but there's also foreign purchases of US Treasury bonds. Americans are the bulk of the buyers, but without the foreign buying of US Treasury bonds, interest rates would be much higher. Because you know from your studies that there's a negative correlation between the price of a bond and the interest rate. I mean, it's a market-driven price-interest rate relationship. So, I mean, in one sense, you can argue this is just a mutually beneficial arrangement. Why should we allow Trump to spoil it? Good question. Okay, so this is the leading foreign holders of US Treasury securities as of October. China, 1.1 billion. This is not the other instruments. This is just the Treasury bonds. Japan is all roughly neck and neck with China. And then you have all these dubious things like Cayman Islands, which might be Chinese money coming back from the Cayman Islands. Hong Kong, which is surely Chinese money coming through Hong Kong, invested into the US. Okay, so this is not just Treasury debt, but also asset-backed securities, also equities, and short-term debt. So I've highlighted the Chinese figures in red. If you add up across all the categories, you're looking at 1.8 trillion. And if you add Hong Kong, it's 2.1 trillion. So the Chinese have a huge stake in this, I call it portfolio investment in the US. This is a cartoon. So Great Wall is matched by Great Wallet, US debt. And by the way, why are there so many governments happy to put money into US Treasuries? Because the dollar remains something like 62% of official reserves. For whatever reason, the dollar is still the world's favorite currency. Not only in terms of reserves, but also in terms of commodities, in terms of trade invoicing. I mean, if a Malaysian firm exports wood to Brazil, they won't invoice in real or ringgit. They'll most likely invoice in US dollars, out of historical habit or whatever. So how long can this go on? Well, the point of this cartoon is simply that there's no collateral. It's all based on faith. Faith in both governments cooperating and continuing this mutually beneficial situation. I mean, if you do a quick calculation, depending on the year, much of this is not even making money. I did a calculation in May 2012, where the Chinese government had invested in a 7-year bond in 2005, they actually lost a little bit of money. So it's not yielding anything, it's just an act of support on the part of Japan. And there were some Japanese funds which bought US Treasury bonds at 120 yen per dollar, and when they sold, it was 100 yen per dollar. You know, the yen has been fluctuating between 80 and 125. That's a huge, percentage-wise, a huge swing, which can more than negate or wipe out the 2-3% that you earn in interest on the bond itself. So why are they doing it? Well, partially it's because once you, I don't know if this is an Indian proverb or not, if you're sitting on a tiger, you don't want to get off because the tiger may come and eat you. You keep riding out of, in academic jargon, it's called path dependence. You just keep going. So, and most of the world's reserves are in dollars anyway, so let's keep our money in dollars. If you sell the dollars, especially if all these governments did that simultaneously, that would really cause a problem. I mean, in a doomsday scenario, let's say, heaven forbid it doesn't happen, but there's some war or disruption between the US and China and other countries, all the foreign holdings of treasury bonds would be sold by the Chinese. And simultaneous selling of, 2.1 trillion would, first step one, they would sell the bonds. You sell the bonds, the price goes down. Interest rates would spike, maybe double or triple what they are. It would become a real hit to the American consumer. But that's only at the beginning of the doomsday scenario. Once the bonds are sold, then Chinese government has dollar cash in its hands. Step two, they would take the dollar cash to the exchange market and sell hundreds of billions of dollars. That means the value of the dollar in the exchange market would go down.
But again, a hypothetical case, could they not recognize those bonds and say, in case of war, say those bonds are not sellable? That typically, worst case, almost like what they do with the terrorist organization, they say that their accounts are frozen. So they say those bonds are frozen.
It could happen. Yeah, so in a real military type of emergency or conflict, that can happen. Or they can make the dollar non-convertible. But all of this is anathema. I mean, what you just suggested is completely against the grain of all these Republican, free market-oriented people. Now, of course, Trump is not Republican. He may be the Republican nominee, but until 2004, he was a Democrat. He's actually not loyal to anybody except himself. So anyway, I digress into politics. Yeah, so in a military-style emergency, then that could be...
Because the bonds are typically sold only in a military kind of emergency. And in that case, the US government says, well, those bonds are no longer valid.
But they have to shut down the entire bond market, or at least say, which sounds terrible to a free market-oriented person, that certain holders are prevented, Chinese, from selling it. Everybody else can buy and sell. But nevertheless, that would surely precipitate a collapse in the faith in the market. See, this whole structure of mutually beneficial relationships is based on faith. And in fact, modern economies are based on faith. That I go to the bank, the rupee note says I promise to pay the bearer whatever, 1 rupee, 10 rupees or 100 rupees. All is based on faith, yeah. So if faith breaks down, the economies break down. There's another angle to this. My argument is that the doomsday scenario is very unlikely because this is a mutually beneficial relationship. Also, as far as the Taiwanese, the Singaporeans, the Indians are concerned, they want the US to remain strong. The Chinese also want the American consumer to have low interest rates, remain happy, and keep buying their products. And also the resiliency of the US economy has been very good in the past. And if you hold the reserves in euros, you know what has happened to the euro. Gone down from $1.50 to $1.10 in the last couple of years. This is another cartoon. US budget deficits are likely to go through the roof or the ceiling. So this is what I was saying earlier. A lot of wealth is bottled up in China. In the last 18 months, a lot of that wealth is trying to get out, and as a result, there's devaluationary pressure on the RMB, which the government is fighting by trying to buy back its own currency by selling dollars from the dollar reserves, which is exactly the opposite of what Trump is alleging. So here are the numbers. The Chinese holdings of dollar-denominated reserves had hit 4 trillion. It has come down to below 3 trillion now. They've run through a trillion in, this sort of says the same thing. That in the last 18 months, the Chinese have been really trying to support unsuccessfully their currency's value. And it's only in the last 2 months that they reintroduced more stringent currency controls, like reduce the amount of convertible currency, that has worked and stabilized the RMB at today's 6.8 or something like that. This is saying the same thing, drawing down of their reserves. Okay, so I'm going to go to make a transition to India. Just a few quick comments. There's so much maneuvering going on to get money out of China that this billionaire has stockpiled 5 billion worth of aluminum in the Mexican desert and in Vietnam. Just as a way of diversifying his holdings. That's one angle. The US government also alleges that this is cheating because certain shapes of aluminum, it's an extruded metal, certain shapes attract different tariffs. So you do a quick calculation. What is the cost of remelting a shape and re-extruding it in another shape, which will attract a lower tariff? If the difference in the tariff rates justify the remelting and re-extrusion, so that's one accusation. Excuse me. The other accusation is that aluminum coming from Vietnam attracts a lower rate than aluminum coming in from China. So the government was accusing him of dumping. So this will become a big issue. The Trump administration is going to get much more tough with maneuvers being played by importers, games being played by importers. I mean, an apocryphal story I heard when I was working for Tata International, I don't know if it's true, they said a clever Indian importer bought thousands of pairs of luxury brand shoes outside India, which is prohibited, and then separated the left from the right, and only imported the left as scrap, leather scrap. Then a few months later, he imported only the right as leather scrap. The extra cost is what? The labor to put the pairs together and put them back in the box. I don't know if this is a true story or not. Movies. There was a movie about this. So is this called Chalak or Jugad? Which one is it? Okay. I think Jugad means, frugal innovation, okay. Anyway, so importers have been playing games like this, but this guy, of course, has been playing games in the hundreds of billions with this aluminum stock. This is just one picture. He's got $5 billion worth of inventory stockpiled in Mexican deserts and in Vietnam. Okay, I don't think I'll spend too much time on recapitulating the summary. We did the calculation for the number of jobs involved in each country for the other. We did a calculation for the extra cost to the US consumer if, hypothetically, the manufacturing came back from China to the US. We saw that the surplus dollars earned by the Japanese and Chinese are very kindly recirculated back into the US Treasury instruments, mainly out of self-interest and to support the US consumer and government. The future may be different because China is now undergoing a transition where with the one-child policy, labor has plateaued out, the number of workers, and wages are rising in the east coast of China at 15% per year, which has already led many companies to relocate operations from China to other low-wage countries. So then the question is, should India step into the shoes of what China is vacating? So globalization has been a very happy thing for India, China, and the US. The US consumer enjoys reasonably well-made cheap products. Deng Xiaoping launched the participation by China into the world market in 1978. Narasimha Rao did the same thing in 1991. And one reason, by the way, why China is ahead of India is because they started their process of liberalization and globalization so many years earlier. I mean, that's part of the explanation. It's not the entire explanation. China has benefited enormously. And this is World Bank data. The World Bank has a criterion of $1.90 per person per day as their criterion for grinding poverty. China used to have 700 million people. Very, very poor. Today, it's about 8 billion. I'm sorry, 8 million. They've almost wiped out poverty in China. Regrettably, in India, the figure is still around 300 million. So by this criterion, World Bank criterion of grinding poverty, there are two places where this poverty persists. One is in India. And of course, even 300 is a figure that's lower than 10, 20 years ago. But India has a ways to go, and the other place is Africa. Otherwise, in the rest of the world, including China, this really grinding poverty has almost been wiped out, thanks to economic progress, globalization, and so on. Anyway, make in India. So you probably know this. This is called in strategy courses, it's called the smiling curve. So you have different stages of the production process, and this is the extent of value capture or profitability. And Foxconn is here. They hire hundreds of thousands of people who do nothing but pick up a motorized screwdriver and go psst, psst, and they assemble iPhones and things like that for very low wages. But what Haier is trying to do is to go upward on the right-hand side, create brand value, which Indian companies have done to some extent, like TCS, at least in the IT field. Tata Consultancy is known as a name, Infosys is known. But otherwise, Indian companies outside India are not known in terms of brand. The other thing to do is Huawei, which 20 years ago, not only nobody had heard of Huawei outside China, but they were, again, very low technology. Today, they have their own R&D centers, not only in China, but in Europe and the United States. So they're climbing the value ladder in this direction. And of course, Apple has captured both ends. Apple doesn't produce any iPhones or iPads. They're not producers, they're orchestrators, they're coordinators. And their capture of value is based on beautiful designs, high-tech R&D, as well as on one of the most internationally well-known brands in the world. So Apple iPhone retail value is something like $500 to $700, depending on the model. The cost to Apple adds up to $179 on average across all the phone categories. So that what I'm trying to say is that Foxconn that finally assembles the iPhones and ships them across the Pacific Ocean invoices Apple at $179 per phone. Even though Foxconn itself has received only $8 to $12 for the assembly work. Because components are coming into I think Shenzhen or Guangdong province from Germany, from South Korea, from Japan, from the United States. They're just assembled by Foxconn. They get $8 to $12 per phone, but then the assembled phone value is invoiced at $179 and shipped to the United States. So, you know the answer to this. What explains the difference? Well, here it is. Beautiful R&D, beautiful designs, as well as high brand value. That explains the difference. The gross margin is the difference between 500 or 700 and 179. Another question I'm asking is, do trade statistics tell us the correct picture? And the answer is no. Let me go to the next slide. So the total invoice value, let's assume 11.2 million phones, invoiced at $179 each. You're looking at annual shipments for the iPhone of something like more than $2 billion being shipped from China to the United States. The American component has a value, whatever components are being made in the US and shipped the reverse direction to China, amounts to only 121 million. That means in terms of the trade balance just for the iPhone itself, you're looking at a deficit of almost $1,900 million. So that sounds terrible, right? But if you look at the value-added comparison, in China, if you take $8 to $12 multiplied by the 11 million phones, the value added in China is 90 million. American components, 122 million. So actually the US, on a value-added comparison in US versus China, is enjoying a surplus. So trade statistics alone can be very misleading and are less than half the picture. That's my point I'm trying to make. But also, the other point I'm trying to make is, now that Apple has said it wants to come to India, what will it do? Will it really do high-value R&D? Or will it just do screwdriver assembly? They won't do it because they don't manufacture themselves. They'll bring in their Foxconn partner, which has already agreed to invest in Bangalore or someplace. But when you look at this is BCG. You know, the BCG has a list of global challengers, meaning the most dynamic and profitable emerging market companies. Every year they publish a list. Their Indian list includes companies like Dr. Reddy's, Sun Pharmaceuticals, Suzlon, and they're not low-end manufacturers by any means. I mean, they are doing a lot of their own R&D. Mahindra is doing creative development of vehicles. Reliance is another. So my question is, as China vacates this screwdriver assembly type of work because of rising wages and a less competitive exchange rate, should India step into that and employ millions of people just to pick up screwdrivers and do repetitively? Or should India focus on the more creative, the higher value portions of the chain, into higher R&D, into design, into brand development, creative marketing? What do you think?
Farok, isn't that a normative question? I would rather phrase the question in a very different way. Is it possible for India to get into that competitive position vis-a-vis China in the low-cost manufacturing? The answer is no. So it's not about should.
You're saying no?
No, it's not about should.
You're saying it's not possible?
If you asked a normative question, my answer would be great. Yes, it will be lovely to do
As a
it,
desirable thing, but you're saying it's not possible?
It's not possible. So
Because?
I would rather ask the question, is it possible or is it not possible?
Okay, so why do you say it's not possible? I'd like to learn.
Well, there are many reasons why it's not possible. To give you a small example of it, you know, we are building the greatest statue in the world. Sardar Patel statue is going to be built as a symbol of Indian manufacturing.
It'll be the tallest, or?
It'll be the tallest in the world of statues. And where do you think it's going to be made? Made in China.
Oh.
The Sardar Patel statue is being cast in China. So I think you have your answer that we don't have the capabilities. We don't have the
Yes.
manufacturing capabilities. And the second problem is that, so it's not a normative question.
You're just saying it's not possible. It's desirable but not possible.
It may be desirable. I don't even think it's
No,
desirable.
it's desirable only because, as by my calculation, every year 13 million males, not to say nothing
No,
about
that is well
females,
known. That is well
come
known.
out and seek
No, no,
jobs.
that is very well known, Farok, but this is not going to provide the answer to that. This is not the solution. But what is going to happen as far as the companies are concerned, they will be able to satisfy. You were doubting that Apple will satisfy, how will it satisfy 30%? My answer is that is not a problem. It can satisfy 30%.
Yeah, if a company is forced to, if Apple is forced to, it can somehow come up with a number of 30%.
Yes, not somehow, it can do it quite easily.
But also somehow, if you don't mind my interruption, there was a well-known case of an American company that imported shirts made in China or Bangladesh, I forget. But they imported them without the buttons and without being ironed. So the American labor, being expensive, sewing on just the buttons and ironing and folding it, putting it into a nice box, added enough, more than 50% of the value, which then enabled them to claim that this was a shirt made in the United States.
There are other ways of doing it, and companies are doing it, and the way Apple is planning it is a different way.
But it's not either or. Like you can contribute at the higher value chain and low value. You can contribute at both levels.
That's my conclusion, that India can follow both strategies.
Yeah, because for India, it's I don't think we have an option to either or. We need to be in both the spaces, but the competitiveness cost would determine where do we pitch in more and where do we pitch in.
Because there's a lot of Indian workers who are very educated, very creative. They can do the R&D, they can do the marketing, the brand development. That's at the upper end. But then you also have these millions of people looking for jobs. Yes, and there are obstacles. I myself am going to mention some of them. I mean, before I do that, just quickly, BCG, Boston Consulting Group, says that India is even more cost competitive, just on cost, than China in terms of ranking, 87 compared to 96. But cost, manufacturing cost at the factory level is only one part of the story. What about the cost of transport to the rest of the market? What about octroi? What about people stopping the truck and saying, hey, there's something wrong with your truck and I'm going to delay it for 1 day unless you give me a bribe, you know, that kind of thing. But before that, also, this is data from United Nations. Chinese, I'm sort of saying the same thing. The Chinese population has plateaued out. The labor force has plateaued out. But the Indian projections, depending on which projection you use, you know, very soon, within 5 years, India, maybe earlier, India will become the biggest population on Earth. So that's why I asked the question earlier, is this a demographic dividend? I mean, early in the Modi administration, people were all puffed up and saying, oh, this is wonderful. And it is wonderful in the sense that if you have a young population, there's a sense of dynamism and optimism in the society, which is what they meant by demographic dividend. But if you don't provide jobs for them, in the long run, it could become a political time bomb. And just very quickly, total number of people in the workforce. India, 481 million. In China, 793. Now, wait a second. I asked myself, the Indian population is not that small, that much smaller than the Indian population. So how can there be such a big gap between 793 and 481? The answer is participation by females is abysmally small in India, only 27% compared to 64% of Chinese women. And adult literacy rates are much lower. And the regrettable fact is, now look, I know that the Congress government did a lot of good things. I don't deny that. And for example, yes, they were protectionist, but that has enabled the pharmaceutical industry to become more competitive under the infant industry argument. You know what I mean by that. Although the infant industry didn't grow up for 50 years. He was a 50-year-old infant. Anyway, they did a few good things, but one thing I will fault to the old Chinese government and Nehru is that they didn't promote primary education. Whereas Mao, who may have been a monster and killed 20 million people, one thing he did insist on, that every small child knows how to read and write. So remember I was earlier asking the question, why is China ahead of the of India? Well, one answer is that they began their liberalization much earlier than 1991. Second part of the answer is basic literacy rates. And you say, well, what has literacy rates got to do with why China is ahead? Because if you're a literate person, your whole world view is different. You think in a different way. And that makes a difference in economic performance. And not only at the factory level, but in terms of how the society is organized. The other thing is, of course, the ease of doing business. World Bank rankings. Singapore is number 1. Eritrea is number 189, lowest rank. China is 90, but look at India, 142. For all these infrastructural, regulatory obstacles, what do you call them? Babus, right? In fact, I myself left India a long time ago, partially because I was frustrated. I and my managing director in Tata's would go to Delhi periodically and beg the Monopolies and Restrictive Practices Commission or something, it was called, saying, please, please let us begin business in finished leather, which is a multi-million-dollar project. And India, of course, is 27% of the world's cattle and animal population, from which you make skins and leather. So the resources were there. The economic logic was impeccable to serve the fashion market in Europe. Export earnings, and still the government would say, no, no, we're not going to allow Tatas to get into this field. So I got frustrated. Instead of being an engineer, executive, I was becoming a lobbyist, going with this guy, my managing director, to Delhi and appearing before the Udyog Bhavan and saying, please, allow us to. Now, happily, that license Raj is not entirely gone, but is gone to some extent. So India ranks in ease of doing business much worse. In fact, it's in the bottom of the rankings. Or take the truck is stopped by the octroi people, but even when it reaches the port, this is per ship figures. So in Chennai, you're looking at a throughput per day of 310 containers. In Bangkok, it's 1,300. Even in Colombo, it's 1,400. So the ports are another sort of infrastructure story besides roads. Anyway, you know this, that Chinese exports have zoomed, and what is surprising to me is that even in services, China is much bigger than India. Very quick story here about garment exports. You would think that India and Nepal and Pakistan would be logical garment producers, but because labor rates are low. Bangladesh alone exports more than India and Pakistan put together. And of course, China is the big elephant in this, even though their labor rates are much higher. And China is about half the world's garment exports. And even Germany, or look at Italy out here. Of course, Italy and Germany are not producing low-end shirts and blouses. They're producing high-quality automobile seats, the $3,000 purse, and so on. So the value is higher, despite their high wages. Okay, so here's reinforcing your point, gentlemen back there, that you had the smiling curve where you say the ends are more profitable than the middle. But even the middle is profitable, provided you don't have the regulatory, the red line is the regulatory impediments and extra costs imposed on basic assembly factories. Now, to the extent that the Modi government can improve labor laws, allow more flexibility in labor, to the extent that GST now is trying to get rid of octroi and trucks being stopped and have a unified market, maybe the red line can go lower. So maybe there is room for India to become, so some Indian companies can, like you said, remain in the low-end screwdriver assembly, which can still give some value. After all, Foxconn is in business. They make money. Whereas the more creative companies like Dr. Reddy's, Infosys, etc., can go up this way, more R&D. And who knows, maybe some Indian companies can develop global brands and capture the higher end right-hand side of the value chain. So my answer is both. Now, maybe you can disagree. Thank you for your attention, and I've learned something also from your comments. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to continue the discussion if you care to. So the statue will be Sardar Patel. But the Bombay government is trying to do the same thing with the statue of Shivaji. Well, at the same time, I've heard voices in the US saying that they should dismantle the Statue of Liberty. Because if immigrants are not welcomed, then why have it? It just attracts attention of potential immigrants. Send it, and first of all, it's not American made. The Statue of Liberty was made in France. Send it back there. That's just a joke, of course. So there's nothing wrong with statues. No, please. Now we are over. You may. There's nothing wrong with statues. It can help to some extent creating nationalist feelings. But the trouble with nationalism is that you can overdo it very quickly. I mean, look at Trump. He essentially is beating the nationalist, protectionist, nativist drum. Okay, thank you.